So I would just like to introduce our next moderator, who will then introduce our panelists, just to say that in putting together this program, one of our goals at the Carter Center was to bring focus to certain issues that are of global concern, and that we all have a part in solving. And in particular, the issue of human trafficking is one that concerns every country on earth, and the United States very specifically, and Atlanta even more specifically, because of what President Carter mentioned earlier about Atlanta being a major hub. The busiest airport in the world is the Atlanta airport. And therefore, we have an issue here in Atlanta that fits with the topic of this conference. And because there is a very exciting coalition of religious organizations, people of faith, together with the state in looking at solutions for human trafficking. So I just wanted to honor that commitment that we have to mention it to this global issue that applies to us here in Atlanta. And our wonderful moderator, Aronde Creighton of Street Grace, will guide us for this panel discussion.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you once again, President and Mrs. Carter, Dr. Hardman, and Karen for inviting us. Of course, we also have the unenviable task of following a buffet lunch, but I can assure you that with this panelist group of panelists that we have, you will stay awake and engaged. This morning, as I was preparing for the second day of this forum, I had the news on in my room, like many of us do in the morning. And quite honestly, it will just play unless something about my favorite sports team comes up, and then I'll kind of key in and listen. But there was a story about President Obama's visit to Senegal, and it caught my attention yesterday. And one of the reasons that it did is the President visited Gorée Island. And a photographer did a beautiful job of capturing a moment of President and Mrs. Obama standing at the door of no return. And I think it was a combination of the emotion and the passion that you saw in their faces. But also, what it reminded me is that for many people, they think that there is no large-scale problem with human trafficking or slavery. They unfortunately think and believe that the Great Atlantic Slave Trade, as it's called in history, was the last time there was any large-scale enslavement across the world. And that's unfortunate. If you take a look at last year's 2012 report by the UN's Office of Drug and Crime, the executive director, Yuri Fedotov, stated that at any one time, there are approximately 2.4 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. And that's at one time. That's not a cumulative number. So that's not over the course of a month or a week. That's at any given one time. So those numbers are even larger. They also pointed out that this is a $32 billion criminal enterprise because we're treating 75% of those victims, who are women and girls, as products and commodities. Mm-hmm. To put that in perspective, that $32 billion is almost as much as the makers of this device that I'm using, Apple Computers, who posted $41.4 billion in net income in 2012. So while the doors of no return in Dakar are not being used now, there are many doors across the world that are being opened for many victims. And if there's ever an opportunity for the faith community to come together and end modern-day slavery, it's now. Mm-hmm. So with that, I'm honored to share this platform with friends and defenders of both women and girls who, unfortunately, many of those victims have walked through their own door of no return. On this panel, we have with me Pastor Paul Palmer of the Atlanta Dream Center, Fulada Moyo of the World Council of Churches, and Cheryl DeLuca Johnson of Street Grace here in Atlanta, Georgia. Each of these panelists will take about 10 to 12 minutes to share stories about how they have engaged the faith community around this issue of human trafficking. And we'll start off with Pastor Paul.
Again, thank you, President and Mrs. Carter, for this venue and all my colleagues. May I say this with great honor. God bless all of you for your efforts in whatever arena that you may be laboring in for the rights of women. I want to just give you a little history of who I am, and I think it will have some insight of why I do what I do. I moved here from a different country, California, and I have learned to perspire like a gentleman here in Georgia the last 10 years. I grew up in a good home, became a hippie. It's hard to tell today that I once had long hair. Came to Christ during the Jesus movement in the 70s, and my life had been forever changed. I am an advocate not just for women and boys in sex trafficking, but for anybody that the world has seemed to have turned a blind eye to. But today, I want to speak on that one subject, sex trade. We have, within the Atlanta Dream Center, which we began 10 years ago, one of our umbrellas, we have 7 major umbrellas for those that are in need, and one is those in sex trafficking. It's entitled Out of Darkness. And that Out of Darkness has actually three buckets within itself. We have the reach aspect, which we call Princess Night, and I'd like to spend a moment just on what we do with Princess Night. We go to the local areas into Atlanta, and we make friends with those who are being sold on the street. It's somewhat risky in the minds of the world, but once you get out there, it is a free opportunity to reach into a world that seems to be destitute, a world where they can't trust men or women. And we come in with just a simple venture or a simple gesture of love. And can I state this as a scripture, if I may? The Bible says they will know you for your love for one another, by your love for one another. And that isn't just us loving one another here because we are like faith or because we're in the faith world, but it's loving the unlovely. If you've ever been unlovely and someone has loved you, it captures your attention. It'll arrest you. And that's what happened to me. And that's why it drives me to love the unlovely. Those who are invisible, those that we drive by and ignore, those that we're afraid of because we don't understand their plight. And we go home and pray that somebody will make a difference in their lives. Well, I thank you for praying because you have caused me to thrive to help those. Our Princess Night ministry, we go out on certain nights of the week, and we do this consistently. Our goal is to be there whenever they're needed. We greet the women with roses and a card, handwritten card. We look for some prophetic word to give them, how beautiful they are, or how their dreams of childhood are just outside their reach, and we want to help them reach it. Only the women get out of our vehicle. The men stand around the car. It's just a substance of strength. And they pray with these women if the boyfriend, a pimp in this society is called a boyfriend. If the pimp is close by, we will not engage the woman. We know that they will be hurt and possibly beaten for wasting time with us. And once we see that they're free and they're alone, we don't go if there's 2 women. We engage them with the rose, tell them they're beautiful. We have a gift for them. And if they respond, we take time to pray with them and ask them what their dreams and desires are. We have a 2,400 hours. Seems like 2,400 hours in a day at times. 24-hour hotline with 12 numbers, 12 phones with that number. And whoever answers that number is obligated to rescue that girl within a 90-minute period. Sometimes it's hard to get away from their boyfriends for any length of time, so we try to get there in that window. If they call, that takes us to the next step, the second bucket of our organization, and that is Out of Darkness. Out of Darkness is our rescue organization. They would rescue that girl. There will be a man and a woman. We never send just one man or 2 men. There is a fear of men in this trade. We always send a woman to comfort, and they do the speaking. And they take them out right away, buy them a meal, sometimes go get some clothes if they need some appropriate clothing. And we have a safe house, which is called Solomon House. It's a transitional home, which we take them to for 14 to 21 days. There we take care of all their legal problems that they have. And we have a law firm on staff with us, and they go to court for them. They'll release them from any warrants at the time as they go through our programs. They handle all their legal dilemmas, whatever they may be. And once they come into our home, they're greeted with a life partner. Yes? Oh, slower. I'm sorry. Translators hate me, don't they? Once we take them into our safe house, we greet them with a life partner or a mentor. And that woman, and it's usually a couple. And the reason we have a couple, we want to show that all men are not bad. That some men actually have a heart for women in a pure way, desiring nothing from them except their best interests. And they become a life partner. They meet with them on a weekly or every 10 days or so. They take them out, get their hair done, their nails done, buy them clothing, maybe take them out for a special meal. This is all the way through the program. Once the 21 days are up, we put them into a program. And through that year program, they keep in contact with them. This is where we're at today with human trafficking in Atlanta. Cheryl's going to share much of this on children, but Atlanta is known as the #1 city in Atlanta for prostituting, for exploiting children in this sex trafficking. Atlanta of the United States. And one reason is, as mentioned earlier, Karen mentioned, is because of our massive airport. Easy transportation in and out. In a day's time, you could travel just about anywhere and be here for this horrible, horrible industry. The stats you can find just about anywhere, and they'll vary depending on who does the stats. But if there was just one, let me say this, if there was just one, this ministry would not close a door until that one was taken care of. Jesus said in Matthew 25, "When I was hungry, you fed me, and when I was naked, you clothed me." I'm going to assume that you will know most of this scripture. And they asked, "Jesus, when did we see you naked?" They used the plural, we. "And when did we see you naked or hungry?" And he said, "When you," and I'm going to use that in a singular fashion, "when you did this unto the least of these, you did it unto me." I'm grateful for group efforts. I'm grateful for the majority of you that are working to change the law. We need that. We need the laws changed. I'm thankful for those who are setting up safe houses and those things as well. But like in times of war, there are victims that are screaming while we're at our tables doing peace talks, and they're screaming for somebody to help. During times of disaster, while we have our committees come together, there's people that are starving and wounded and bleeding. And I want to encourage you, not as a group, but as an individual, to fight this plight against humanity. That you are capable to do something. You may not go into the hood, to the street where these women are being exploited, but you could be a voice today. You don't have to wait for the council to end or have a committee with something drafted to present to your legislatures or your state or your presidents or your religious leaders. I believe it is our duty as Christian leaders, each and every one of us, to suffer the consequences, to step into uncomfortable situations. As our sister asked in the last session, and I'm not sure where you are now, you were there, and we talked about the endangerment. And Sister Simone answered it well. I would like to tag onto that as I close. Some things and some people are worth dying for. And to risk your life and to step into danger because you have a cause and a call I'll get from God and a duty to love others, so be it. I want to thank you for allowing me to share this time with you. God bless all of you.
Thank you, Paul. Just as Paul said, a lot of times in this situation, whether it's domestically here in the United States, whether it's internationally, being there when these victims need you is always a first step. And so with that, I want to transition over to Fulata Moyo to talk a little bit from the perspective of the World Council of Churches and talk about this issue from an international perspective.
Good afternoon. No one is answering except Karen. Good afternoon. Oh, I am Fulata, and I want to start from my name. I was born Fulata, which means I was born legs first, feet first. And my mother was the precious young, well, at the time when I was born, because I was last born, she was in her 40s, but the time when my first sister was born, she was only 18 years old. She was the third wife to my father, and she actually, she was married to my father's third wife because she escaped from some stigma because she was divorced at 16 from the first marriage. But anyway, that's a long story. She didn't have much education. But one thing that I remember about my mother was that every day she had a Bible next to her pillow. I will not describe to you how the pillow looked like, but she had a Bible, and this Bible was the Tumbuka translation, one of the languages in Malawi. And every morning she would first of all read the Bible before she did anything else. And I became very curious about this book. And so one day I remember I asked her, I said, "What's in this book?" And she said, "Read it for yourself. I thought you go to school." And I was not sure I really wanted to read it, but because curiosity also had a better part of me, I started sneaking reading the book. And as I read it over and over again, I discovered one thing, that it was actually in the African Christianity that my mother was in, and I didn't associate myself very much as a Christian because my mother being third wife meant as children we were not baptized because we were not allowed, we were not accepted as proper children of my father. But because of that, I was not very happy or very interested in this religion. But looking at the way this Bible seemed to really influence my mother's decisions over and over again, I realized that to her, this Bible was contextually an African book that was like her manual for daily life. It answered her questions. I don't know how at that time, but that really was very interesting for me, and I am so thankful to my mother that she challenged me to read it myself, because reading it myself meant that I really had to try to find meaning from it. But I'm starting from there because what I want to say is mainly that working with World Council of Churches and addressing issues of trafficking of women and girls as one of the issues that dehumanize women has been mainly not so much in the field as Paul has explained from his presentation, but it has been mainly working on how to really influence certain understandings of scripture and theology in a way that would help the churches, member churches, to take part in raising awareness against such a dehumanization. And so the Bible for us has been one of those sources of theology that we have used. And for me, I found that using the Bible was very important, especially 4 years ago when I started working with World Council of Churches in 2007. And I'm responsible for the program on women in church and society. And we have been focusing mainly on addressing violence against women by working with women as well as working with men. But 3 years ago, I was in Thailand for a meeting, and we were taken to a center where they keep young women who have been rescued from trafficking. And it's so many young women who have been trafficked from the borders of Thailand and Laos and different other countries. And one particular girl was 14 years of age, that when I was walking in, because I was coming with a team of 30 people that we were in this meeting with. And this girl was 14 years old, and she was pregnant, 8 months pregnant. And she was looking at me because I was walking towards her. She was looking at me, but it was like I couldn't see her in her face, in her eyes. she was not in her body. She was not, I was like I was meeting a body which didn't have a life in it. And I was really, it haunted me for a long time. And then I started talking to the people who were running this ministry of these young women, young girls, actually. I talked to one of the leaders, a woman. I said, I mean, how do you deal with these girls? And she said, oh, yeah, well, I mean, we teach them the Christian principles of forgiveness because most of them have been trafficked and then abused sexually. And this girl, 14 years old, was abused by 3 men who promised to help her, give her transport. And she didn't even know who the father of her child was. And so they said, we have taught her the importance of forgiveness, and that she should forgive the people, and she should also embrace the baby as a gift from God. And looking at this girl, certainly it was very clear to me that they did not even listen to this girl. They did not even engage this girl. They didn't even maybe ask her to say, what are you feeling? What are your questions? And I saw that it was so important on how do we read scripture? How do we interpret these kind of things? And one of the ways that from that meeting, actually, that same meeting, the day after we had a Bible study, and the person who we were working with was using contextual Bible study methodology, which is a brainchild of liberation theology. And she was using this, and she read from the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, she read it as a text on trafficking of women and girls. And she raised issues about the deprivation that actually makes women risk and become victims of trafficking, and how this deprivation actually for her, when she looks at the book of Ruth, she sees Ruth and Naomi as 2 deprived women. And they are so deprived that at the end of the day, although Naomi and Ruth in the Bible, it shows that they have a very good relationship, but it is, for her, it was clear that Naomi at the end of the day had to use young Ruth to be able to rescue back the possibility of their livelihood. And that, she said, for her, Naomi was not unlike the traffickers, the women who are mediators, they are the intermediate or the Johnnies or however you call them, because most of them are also very desperate and they have to use somebody else. And Naomi, if it was about love or partnership, she should have been the one marrying Boaz. I mean, if you read the story. But because Boaz keeps on referring to Ruth as my daughter, my daughter, my daughter, and she instructs Ruth to go and cover the feet of Boaz, which in the Hebrew text tradition, I was told, it means actually that was what women who were in sex trade would actually do, to uncover the feet, who had sexual implication. And so reading that text that way, for me, actually was really very helpful, but it raised several questions, and 2 of them that I just want to finish with, which she asked. She asked us several questions, because contextual Bible study reading, according to how you still use reading according to how the writer, what influenced the writer. You still explore that, but also you allow the context of the readers to interact with the writer, the context of the writer, to raise awareness for activism for justice. And one of the questions she asked in this Bible study was do you have, this was interpretation question. She said, do you have Ruth's and Naomi's in your community? And what are their stories? And as a faith community, what do you do about their stories? Thank you very much.
As you can see, I was not lying when I said this group will keep you engaged. I think that a common theme that we've heard not only in this presentation but in our presentation earlier is the use of sacred text and how it's important to begin to study that for ourselves and understand exactly what Scripture is saying. The earlier panelists spoke of the connection of the mutilation that happens with women and the connection to the Quran and how that was enlightening for many people to read and understand that that was not truly the case of what was being said. And here again, thank you, Falata, for talking about the context and story of Ruth. As we begin to wrap up this panel and open it up for questions, I want to shift back over to my left here to Cheryl DeLuca Johnson with Street Grace. And Cheryl.
Okay. Good afternoon. I got the same thing. I have to start this off first by saying that my journey into women's issues began with President Carter and Mrs. Carter when I marched for the ERA that he talked about many years ago in South Georgia, where if you know anything about South Georgia culture, it was not a popular theme. But it did change the focus and the direction of my life and ultimately led me here. I am the CEO and president of an organization called Street Grace. Street Grace began as a collaboration of churches that learned about the issue in Atlanta, which we now, because we like to use acronyms in America, we call DMST, Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking. And the reason we use that term is to distinguish it from international sex trafficking that also occurs here. Because we have in our society this idea, in this affluent, influential society, that we don't have these issues and these problems. And yet in our home state, my home state, the state I'm proud to share with President and Mrs. Carter, hundreds of children that will be trafficked each month to thousands of men. We have been listed in the FBI report. The FBI came out with a report that listed 14 cities, and this was one of the cities that they listed. And although I love my city, this is definitely something that needs to change. The good news is, and I hope the encouragement that we can give to President and Mrs. Carter at the end of this, is that we are also beginning to be recognized on a national level for the work that we're doing in collaboration. So, in accordance with the request that we talk about some of the themes that were covered in yesterday's agenda, I am going to talk primarily about collaboration and specifically about collaboration around advocacy. First, I think I need to tell you a little bit about Street Grace. Our mission in this area is to lead people, organizations, elected officials on a comprehensive path to ending domestic minor sex trafficking. That pathway is as follows. Awareness. If you don't know that something's happening, there is nothing you can do about it. I think the awareness that has been raised at this forum has been phenomenal. The second thing, once you're aware of something, if we don't give you any way to do something about it, you simply leave frustrated. So the second is empowerment. Awareness, empowerment. Once we've empowered you, we want you to do something. And that is why, like Paul sitting here today, we have 52 community partners with volunteer opportunities that support the lives of children. Get engaged. I think somebody just said it earlier, that one person doing one thing, one time in the life of one person, in our case, one child, can change the lives of children forever. Do something. These three steps lead to social change. And the social change I'm going to talk about, the indicator of social change that I'm going to talk about today, is legislative, the laws that can be changed. And that will end CSEC. Or, I'm sorry, that's the old term, DMST, domestic minor sex trafficking. So there are certain things that we learned in this process, and I think I need to talk about those, that collaborative effort. If anybody has done a collaborative effort, God bless you, because this is the first collaborative effort that I have attempted to do. I am also, my history is I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia, and my work prior to this was always in women's issues, but I dealt with a severely addicted population for many years. And I hope I do not offend, but I have often gone to my board and said at least they knew they were sick. Because the collaboration amongst the faith-based community doesn't always know that they may not be well. So I appreciate the people who are here today. So there were certain things we learned, and one of the things that we learned is I'm a strategic planner and thinker. So I came in saying, okay, here's this group of volunteers and leaders in the faith-based community. I gave them a list of things to do. That did not go over well. Basically, I had nobody attending the next meeting. So I went back and I looked at my own faith, and what did it call me to do? And it says, it calls me to serve, not to ask others to serve. So I changed that. And I went back to this group and I said, here is what I will do. These are the things I will do. And if you want to participate, that's fine. But instead of reporting back to me, I will report to you each time. Now, all of our meetings grow every time we have them. A lesson learned. Know the difference, and I think this is a very important thing. We've touched on it several times, talking about the difference between our religion and our faith and culture. And I'm going to use a couple different terms, but they're the same idea. And it's knowing the difference between polite and respectful. Polite behaviors are dictated by culture, and if you take a poll, you will find many people who have felt that I might not have been polite, but I promise I have always been respectful because that comes from my faith, and it comes from honoring the value in every person. So that's another thing that is important in a collaborative. In that, the language I use is important. I will not whisper. I think that there's a problem with whispering about these issues that have been going on for so long. I will not yell either, because I believe that we're all on the same team. People have asked me, what about your opponents? I said, I have none except those who buy and sell children. So do your research. I think we've talked about that we have to have some data. We have talked about some of the Georgia data here. Know your facts. Know what is going on. One of the things that happened to us when we were gathering these churches together is in our community, within the perimeter of a certain road is the inner city, and outside of that are the suburban and some of the more affluent neighborhoods. And so when we first started talking to those churches or those faith-based communities in the more affluent areas, they would tell us that is not our problem. That is not our issue. That does not happen here. When we had research, God agrees, when we had research to show that the thing that drives this, and we have to understand that it's a business, what drives every business are the people buying, the demand. When we were able to take research that showed that the number of calls for these children came from those affluent suburbs, all of a sudden those faith bases became interested too. And we had many more join. We didn't blame anybody. We simply said, look at this is what's happening. With those rules, we went to collaborate with other groups. Obviously, the first group that we collaborated with were other faith-based institutions. And we found that being very narrowly focused is the key. There are a lot of issues that can divide us. We said, we want to unite on this one. If your doctrine allows that we are to serve the least among us, which to me would be the children who are trafficked for sex, then we can work together. We will not discuss any other doctrines in this mission except how we overlap on this one. So that's one thing that we did, and we stick very closely to that. I tell people I am not smart enough to go in many areas, so I just stay right here. The other thing that we did is we allowed that we understood that amongst, and I know this is probably news to most of you, but amongst some faith-based organizations, there's competitiveness and some politics that goes on. We also said that we will not become involved in those, and that there are small churches and there are large churches. We created a forum where all of them would have a voice. So we began to have churches be involved. The other thing we did is we made sure that the language we used would not dishonor any church that wanted to be part of us. So that's how we worked with the religious denominations. And then we went to peer partnerships, such as Paul here, working with those community members that also had a similar mission. In looking at that, again, I'm going back to a narrow focus. You'll hear this theme a few times. We said, well, we don't have to completely overlap with their mission. As a matter of fact, we kind of don't let our volunteers go on Princess Night because it is fairly dangerous and we were worried about liability. I'm sorry. But we do partner with them in specific areas where we have. So we're not looking for differences. Again, building collaboration. When these two groups got together, we realized, looking at this, we need people to serve directly. There will always be victims. I take that back. We always need to serve the victims. We understand that. But thinking on it, we know that if that is all we do, if every one of us serves victims, we will never end this issue. Because the ending of the issue is with the people buying. And we have to move there. I believe personally in rescuing victims, and I am the mother of 6 children, 2 biological, 4 adopted, 2 international, and 2 out of foster care in the past 2 years. So I am a big believer in rescuing those victims. My husband says I can't be that big a believer anymore, but I'm a big believer in rescuing victims. So we believe in that, but we also know if we don't strategically go after this, nothing will change. The biggest strategy that we can use, the universal strategy, and it's been talked about many times, is, and one of our measures is changing law. Changing law. So we looked as a private faith-based organization to partner with legislators and government entities. Well, let's see. That didn't start off as well as we would have liked. And there were many lessons to be learned there, but the same lessons that we learned in collaborating early worked here. I'm going to tell you a couple of, I'm going to give you an instance of how this first happened. My first experience of going down to the Capitol to talk about this issue was about 4 years ago. And literally, I was patted on the back and said, that's nice, and told to move on my way. When I questioned legislators if they knew that Georgia had been identified by the FBI, they said no, and they said, but we have other things on our agenda. And I said, okay. And so I said, well, I'll just have to keep showing up. So we did. We continued to show up. The first year we had 50. The next year we had 150. This past year we brought 765 citizens to the Capitol to talk about this issue. And the difference that made, I'm going to talk about in one legislative agenda. But I'm going to have a sip of water because I'm sitting with 2 of my heroes up here. In the year 2000, in the state of Georgia, the penalty for someone who sold a 12-year-old child for sex was $50 and a misdemeanor. I am so glad we got that response. So when I got into this and I learned that, I said, well, it is going to be simple. It's common sense. We have to change that. So I went and was asked to testify before a legislative committee, and they do sit you like they show you on television. They sit up here, and you sit down here. But because I had a background as a licensed professional counselor and this background in women's issues and work for Street Grace, they asked me to testify. We thought that it was a sensible law because what we were saying is that anyone under the age of 18, what we consider generally in the United States as a child, is to be considered a victim if they are trafficked in sex. They're to be considered a victim. And so we thought that that was a simple law to pass. When I went to testify, my logic was that, and this may be too much information, but the frontal lobe doesn't develop the executive skills to make decisions until you're in your, 20 years old. our laws reflect that understanding. And so they established that a 16-year-old in the state of Georgia can't consent to sex. They're legally not allowed to have sex. Okay? Our law also states in the state of Georgia that they're not legally allowed to enter into a financial contract until they're 18. So they can't consent to sex until they're 16. They can't enter into a financial contract until they're 18, and yet we were putting 12, 13, and 14-year-olds in juvenile for prostitution. How does that work? So I was asked to testify before this legislative committee. When I got there, that is what, 5, 2, 1. I'm going to finish this story. When I got there and was asked to testify before this legislative committee, I laid out that reasoning. Once I did, I had this question come back to me. They said, you're telling me that there's not a single child in our state that is doing this to get an iPad, to get their nails done, to get their hair done? And I said, no, that is not what is going on. Nobody would choose this. He said, you're telling me that no child has made this choice. I said, okay, yes, they have made a choice. And it is like us standing on the sidewalk watching somebody jump from the 6th floor of a building. We look at them and we say, this choice is dangerous. This choice is going to hurt them and possibly kill them. It makes no sense. What we don't know, that the person jumping knows, is that the building's on fire and that they are making the choice that they think will cause the least harm in their lives. And I said, we as a society have allowed that building to burn. The response I got was a gentleman throwing up his hands, walking away, and saying, well, I guess we know where you stand. Here's where impolite came in. I said, sir, I thought that was the point of my testimony. From that moment to now, in the year 2011, we passed House Bill 200, which changed that original penalty to where it is now up to life in prison and a $100,000 fine for anybody who would traffic a child. So this is the collaboration of faith-based organizations, community organizations, and government officials. Also, as the only faith-based organization who has a chair on the Governor's Office Task Force on this issue, we are also partnered as a faith-based organization with the Department of Education to educate all the teachers in Georgia on this issue. And we partnered with the Attorney General on a program in accordance with our men's movement to put out public service announcements. Collaboration.
Thank you, Cheryl. One of the things that I think is extremely important is the comment that Cheryl made, that the only opponents that we have are those men, women, and adults who are buying sex with children and with adults as well. In fact, we've seen this collaboration come about actually right here in this room. Last month, the sitting Republican State Superintendent of Education convened a conference on human trafficking, which was opened by President and Mrs. Carter's own grandson, State Senator Jason Carter. So this does know no boundaries or partisan lines. It is about our children. It's about the women in our lives. It's about our future. In fact, just to commend the Carter Center for even beginning to initiate conversations about pulling some of the organizations here in the state of Georgia who are doing some of this great work and planning to have a conference next year where we can collaborate and bring law enforcement and government and NGOs and survivors, former exploiters of all kinds together to say, what will it take for us to end this issue? Not just here in Georgia, but then moving across this country and moving across the globe. And those are the things that are so important. There's a quote that I'll end with, and then we'll open it up from questions. William Wilberforce, the British politician and abolitionist, said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." And I think that's very important as we look at this issue, whether it impacts the country that you live in immediately to your knowledge, or whether it impacts your fellow global citizens from all over. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you did not know. So with that, I will open it up for any questions that any of you have for our panelist. Yes, sir.
I wasn't here yesterday, and it'd be helpful to me, maybe if Cheryl could explain to me the extent of the problem in Georgia, and also specifically what additional legislation you are seeking.
It would be my pleasure. The extent of the problem in Georgia, and there is some concern. I know that Georgia State is doing a meta-analysis of all the data to get us correct numbers, but the numbers that we have been working from indicate, and they're from the Shapiro Group, and they have been an ongoing study, indicated between 200 and 300 children a month are trafficked in the state of Georgia. I know at one point one of the statistics was I think it was 128 to 150 girls on a weekend night, which is considered a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night in the state of Georgia, could be sold 10 to 15 times. When we did some math on that, this is a Friday. Every 54 seconds, a child is sold for sex in the state of Georgia. The report that came out years ago that mapped this in the city, I think the title of the report is so telling because it says hidden in plain view. And I think that's what it is here. We're an affluent country, and they picture that. It has been found in rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas. We know that poverty is a risk factor. It is not the only risk factor. If I say, insecure 13-year-old, I'm being redundant. Every child has some risk factors, but poverty increases those. So we know that this is one of those situations where poverty increases the likelihood of victimhood, and that affluence enables those to buy. And that tends to be where the research puts that. When this research on the demand was done, it was through a false escort service that was set up through some volunteer organizations, and we participated in providing some of those volunteers. And the men who called in, they found that it was not located around the airport. Only 9% of the phone calls came from the airport. 42% came from north of the perimeter, which if you're not from Atlanta, you would not know, but those are the most affluent neighborhoods. So that is where the phone calls came. And I will tell you this, which is anecdotal, but I had the opportunity, it was not a privilege, to hear some of these phone calls coming in of these men asking to buy. So you said you had a 14-year-old. Oh, well, when are they available? Is that biracial or is that white? What is this? And the most disturbing part of that, because my husband listened to them too, was that it was like they were ordering a pizza. They were ordering a commodity. And so it is prevalent here. The good news is that because of this public-private partnership, because of the work that the universities are doing, and the faith-based communities and the government officials are doing, Georgia has been looked at and is being looked at as a model for the rest of the United States on how to combat this and come up with a solution.
Cheryl, if you could quickly comment on the one or two laws that we are trying to push within the General Assembly in Georgia.
Well, the place we want to go, we are still working on laws that will provide for the victims, for the children, such as, I know we're looking at revisions of like safe harbor laws and those sort of things. The laws we want to get to are those that would increase the penalties for those who buy. Those are the laws we're looking to get to. We have increased the penalties for those who traffic, for those who sell. But again, if there is no buyer, then nobody needs to sell and there is nothing to sell. So we need to get to the laws that go after demand.
The other thing quickly that we're wanting to focus on in the state of Georgia are also making sure that there are some additional provisions financially given to those victims, because while there are homes that are in place, there are not always the finances to support these children and women being able to move into those facilities. Okay. With that, Susan, I know that you had a question.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting and principled panel. It's an issue I've worked on for a long time. My colleague Rita Nakashima-Brock, I wrote a book called Casting Stones, Prostitution and Liberation, Asia and the United States, and we spent 6 years researching sex trafficking and prostitution. And I've done Bible study with women in Chicago, Genesis House, for a long time. I never thought, Palada, of using the book of Ruth, and I thank you for that great insight and wonderful contextual analysis. But I also teach people to be pastors. I teach people to preach. Out of your experience with the buyer, what do you think are the most compelling theological, biblical themes on which we could preach? Because the buyers are in our pews, in our congregations, on the weekend as well. So what insights have you gained? Because I must say I have puzzled over this a great deal myself. One wants to shame and blame. Ineffective as a transformational strategy in my experience. So what have you learned? What insight can you give us for beginning to use religious texts with that population?
Well, if I could just pass on the religious text for a moment. Buyers just don't wake up one day and indicate that they're going to go out and buy a woman or a child or a young man. They usually start with another force of influence, and that is pornography, or something that they may have learned as a child by sexual abuse. And when I deal with young men, we have a Bible college, and when I deal with those young men in our college that are dealing with uncontrollable lust, we just try to get a whole new picture, that we are one family. And this, I'm going to go back to this love thing for just a moment. Love isn't sex. And I know this is being taped, and I need to be cautious on how I'm going to try to convey something here. It is exploiting. I don't think I'm capable, so I'm going to have to pass on that. I would be so embarrassed if my wife heard me use that terminology. She would be embarrassed of me. It is a power of lust that drives men to buy women. It is a fascination. It's a lack of self-control. And when we talk about the spirit, the fruit of the Spirit, one of it is self-control. And I believe that we have not taught our young men to view women as their sisters, that we view them as an object. You could watch not just contractors, bless their hearts, those construction guys, but you could watch businessmen in suits when a woman walks down the street, how they glance at them and why they're glancing at them in that fashion. Job said this with this in Job 31:1, I made a covenant with my eye not to look upon another woman. He was married. Made a covenant with his eye, a promise with his eye that he would not look upon another woman. We have made it culturally acceptable here in the United States to glance and to even make a comment. And I don't believe we from the pulpit, and I have a pulpit, have taught our young men, either in a private session or either in a public session, that we need to honor these women as our sisters, you women as our sisters. And I think that we have failed in a sense in a religious leadership, that we have just taken that they're young men and this is what they're going to go through. And shame on us, not shame on these young men, but shame on us for not taking the authority which we've been given, God given to us, to take a stand and say no more, no more.
I think also to add to that, Susan, a lot of what we have discussed in both our work groups and in these general sessions about the importance of understanding and redefining this whole issue of what is masculinity, what is acceptable. It speaks exactly to what Paul is talking about here, because in this country, as I'm sure it's a custom in many places, before you get married, there's a bachelor party, and what happens at that bachelor party stays at that party. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, and we have become accustomed to that, and we've accepted that as it's okay for our sons and our brothers to do that, but it is deplorable to think that our daughters, our wives, our sisters would do those things. So a lot of it starts off exactly where what we need to do in our own homes. That's the first place of action that we need to have. Francis, I think you had, and then we'll get to Ruth.
Thank you very much, and I want to say thank you so much to the panel. I believe trafficking is not only in Atlanta, it's also occurring in our country, Liberia. And I have had the opportunity to engage a few of those who do trainings in Liberia on trafficking. And just like Joy said, the thing is, those who are supposed to take decisions do not understand trafficking. I had an opportunity to be at a migration conference in Monrovia. And in that conference, I shed tears because the Assistant Minister of Health, who should have understood trafficking, stood there and said that bringing a child from the interior of Liberia is not trafficking. And I said to myself, where are we going if these are the people that are supposed to make decisions? We have a lot of work to do. But I thank God that we have this opportunity, which is a support for some of us, that we are not the only one faced with those situations. If the great United States have that situation, there is hope for Liberia.
Thank you. Is that Ruth?
Thank you. I'm Ruth Messenger from American Jewish World Service. First of all, I want to say it was a great presentation. And Cheryl, who was, believe it or not, folks, nervous at lunch. It was an extraordinary story of how you do your work and of the very exciting link between direct interventions and service on the one hand and advocacy on the other. That said, I'm going to pose a slightly controversial issue. My organization is an international human rights and development organization, and we actually score high in the amount of work we do against trafficking, sex trafficking, child soldiers, child slaves in the fishing industry. Here's the controversial part. We also support groups of sex workers. And I would just like, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it and throw this open to discussion. And I'm going to say on the big world stage, I loved your analogy of the burning building. You know, the world is burning. And so people make choices that they wouldn't make if they had a chance of walking into the basement of the Carter Center and taking a course in computer technology so that they could go to work upstairs. But I was in Nicaragua last week with one of the many organizations we support, Las Golondrinas, and they said, I'm just quoting one woman, they are an organization of current and former sex workers devoted to helping women in the sex trade and to helping women who want to get out of the sex trade. And when one of my donors said, well, why did you do this? A woman said, I'm speaking for many people here. I was born with no identity card, into abject poverty. When I was 17, I had no place to live. I went to work in a bar. I made money. I've put myself through school. I've bought a home. I've found a partner, and I'm sending my children to school. I'm no longer a sex worker, but I'm going to help anybody who wants to take that route out of poverty because she doesn't have any other choice. I know that's not a question. I apologize to the moderator, but I'm looking for a response because we do this. There's a network of organizations that have set up something called the Red Umbrella Fund, and we fund grassroots groups like this.
Well, I'm going to say, God bless you. We specifically chose our focus to be children because we don't think that they have a choice. I understand the economic sort of situations and how articulately you said that some of these women, it was a choice. Is it a good choice? No, but the building is burning. That's why we specifically focus on children in what we do, because we don't believe that that is a choice.
I agree.
Also to say that World Council of Churches has a membership of 345 churches throughout the world, and some of them are in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, two of our member churches actually engages very interestingly in the issues of trafficking with Philippines as the source as well as destination, as well as transit. And last time when we were there, last year, we went to the streets to meet some of the women who are on the streets who are also working with these member churches. And one of the women that we met was talking to us, who started this ministry within the church. She actually said that she came to Philippines, to Manila, running away from her village in the outskirts because she had been sexually abused by some relative. And when she came to Manila, she had no other choice but to go to the streets. And she was on the streets for some time, but then she was actually stabbed because one of the customers stabbed her, whatever happened, and then she survived. And when she survived, she started going to this church, and she challenged the church to engage. And so what the church discovered was that they had to help both some women who wanted to leave the street, and they also had to make sure that they were accompanying the women who remained on the streets because they had no other choice. And for our this member church, when we were engaging, they were saying, you know, most of the times we have to answer so many questions on the ethical questions about how can we support such. But one response that really moved me, the woman that was speaking, she said, if we live in this world where the disparities are still there, where some women, the only thing they have is their body as a commodity, if we cannot change that disparity, we cannot bring the equality and the justice, then we have no option, but we have to be on the streets with the women who are on the streets, as well as be in the pews with the women who, some of them will still be on the streets, but they will come to the church. So I think we have to work towards ending these disparities. If we don't end these disparities, we will have no option but to also find ways of journeying with the women who have to be on the streets, because there is no other option.
30 seconds, Ruth. What these women are doing around me are doing an excellent job. Cheryl with the children is excellent. We have a different approach, whosoever will. We have taken traffickers off. They've actually called us and asked us for help after we have rescued their girls and become vital citizens in our community. So we rescue children, we rescue women, we rescue men in human trafficking, and also the perpetrators. And the Johns, we minister to the Johns as well.
I just want to make one distinction. To the best of our knowledge, the groups that we work with are actually, I don't know quite how to say it, self-starter groups. There are not traffickers. These are women who've made a choice, and they've banded together, and they're fighting for everything from condoms to health to freedom from the local police.
So we have about 12 minutes left. I want to make sure we get the last 3 questions and leave some time for President Carter and Mona to also, I've got them, to make sure that we get those questions answered, and then some closing comments. Imam, I know that you were waiting.
I realize that in this conversation, there's no presentation of Muslims, what's going on in the Muslim community and how we deal with it. But I would like to bring to your attention 2 things. One is that one of the hot places of trafficking is Middle East. You know, and a very influential capital with a lot of money. I know there's a trafficking. And one of the problems there is that there's something called residence law, which is you have a sponsor somebody sponsor your visa, and then hold your passport. Your freedom actually in the hand of the person who sponsors you. You cannot leave the country. He can deport you anytime he wants. And that is the I call it legalized trafficking. Because you come to the country legal, but being used for sex trade, and sometimes abused by the person who brought you. Therefore, I think in the international law, we should push for the freedom of individuals who come to this country to have their passport and ability to move and to travel. That's number one. Number two is the issue of refugees and sex trafficking. I do believe that one of the problems I have seen, and also in Africa, that the refugees that come from the war zone, when they come, they become very vulnerable, and people take advantage over them. And therefore, I would like to say that maybe you have to have a system in place to make sure that there's also punishment internationally by the international court for those who abuse the refugees, because the country where the refugees been hosted, they're very biased toward the citizen. They will not persecute the citizen against a foreigner who come from another country. And the last thing I would like to say that also dealing with what I call them place of refuge supposed to be for children, and in some countries I have seen, I did work in Darfur and other part of in Africa, where the children have been rescued as children that lost their parents in war. They've been abused by the people who are taking care of them, and therefore that system also has to be checked, be investigated, and so forth. Those are the three areas that I thought maybe to throw out there. And from the Islamic perspective, of course, in Islam, it's prohibited to have even relationship outside of marriage to begin with. But the issue of trafficking or forcing yourself in somebody, or using money and any kind of form of abuse, sexual abuse, it is actually in Islam is verses been designated to address this issue.
Thank you. Larissa, is it?
Thank you so much to a very excellent panel. Ruth, your question sort of prompts me to highlight Cheryl and Street Grace's strategy of collaboration, and in collaboration as a very effective organizing tool for advocacy. Requires one to narrow in on a very focused issue strategy in order to bring together the broadest group possible to have an impact on elected officials. And this is a strategy that Sojourners, which is the organization that I work with, which is a faith-based social justice advocacy organization, is increasingly focusing in on, because we found it to be very powerful. Most recently, in our work to bring evangelicals together for immigration reform, which is remarkable if you're familiar with the American context. And what happened with that was that we came to agreement on a pretty narrow set of principles. And over the course of 2 years and working with this unexpected group that came together, something called a Pathway to Citizenship wasn't initially part of the original, very narrow, agreed on principles. And as we worked with this group of folks who were not previously in relationship, who were able to come together initially on a narrow issue, we were able, through relationship and education and respect, to then broaden to a more controversial issue, to expand the scope of what was possible with this work. So I just commend you for that strategy, and also to share what has worked for us in collaboration, which is an enormous amount of very difficult work. But when it comes to advocacy, can be an incredibly effective strategy for bringing together odd or unexpected groups for big impact.
Thank you for that point, Larissa. And one thing Cheryl did harp on the unity and the fact that Street Grace is an organization that focuses wholly on domestic minor sex trafficking. Just a short, brief example of that, and then we'll have Molly ask the last question. We have a lot of different faiths represented at this forum, but of course many of you know that even here, especially in the United States, we have I don't know, I lost count of how many different denominations within the Christian faith that we have. And Street Grace has been able to pull together the Presbyterian Church and the PCUSA and the 15 to 1,800 different factions of the Methodist Church. And all of these different faiths, because we're unified on one issue, and that is ending domestic minor sex trafficking. That is all that we focus on. If there is any other issue that another church or organization would like to bring to the table, we ask them to do that in their own forum and outside of this particular organization. And the short story I'll tell you that highlights that is the first time that I began to attend one of our volunteer meetings. I had a gentleman who the only thing that we had in common was the fact that he, like Paul and I, shared the same hairdresser. And he told me every single time, I've got a seat right here beside you. Right here, sit right here beside me. In Linwood, we began to form a great friendship. He'll be hitting his late 70s later on this year. And what brought us together was the fact that we were unified behind this issue. We didn't get into partisan politics or anything like that. And the reality is that if we ever did have those dialogues, we would both be in a position where we would want to understand one another because we have a friendship based on the fact that we came together for this common cause. And I think that regardless of the faith community that you come from, once we start from a place of unity and coming together and then begin to explore our differences, it's such a very different conversation to have. And so with that, I will have Molly ask us the last question, and then we'll have closing comments.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel. I'd like to congratulate you also because it's very moving, what you were talking about. And in a way, I hate to end with this question because I feel like it's a bit depressing because a law, we have many laws in Senegal against trafficking, against child marriage, against female genital cutting, and they are almost never applied. And I don't know if the question I have is, since this law has passed and $100,000 in a life sentence, how many the sellers, how many have been convicted? And it may be different here. That's a question I want to ask. Again, I would say it's strange. It's not a social norm in that I think everyone would condemn it, right? And yet it's accepted somehow. It's accepted by society. Somehow there's something there, I don't know what it is, that allows people to say, well, that's how men are. Or, this is, you're always going to have this. There is some level of acceptance, and until this general society stands up and says, let's, as you've said, changes the way they look at this, I don't know if the law is going to do it, although I agree that a law is necessary, but I just would like to know if you think this will really make a difference.
Well, first let me say that I don't think a law will change this, or I would be home gardening. So, yeah, it's not just a law, it's a holistic approach. But the laws are supposed to reflect the ethics of its society. And the fact that we can get the law to change, that's the first step. And generally the way these things happen is there's social awareness, there's social awareness, grassroots, faith-based, then it's the government, the legislative, and you get the laws changed. Then you get the general population of the corporations and those sort of things, the generally accepted kind of groups to buy into it. What we have found is that we don't stop our collaboration at faith-based organizations. We also have, we are partnered with the GBI in the state of Georgia. We are also partnered with the police departments in the state of Georgia. We have offered trainings to them. Is it where we want it to be yet? No, but there have been prosecutions since this has started, and we believe that there will be more. You know, and I'm likening it back to the domestic violence, you know, movement years ago. Until we called this trafficking, there were no victims. Now we know that there were, that we just didn't have a term for it. So you first have to have the language, then you have to have the buy-in, then you have to have the laws, and then you have the implementation. But I am pleased to say that law enforcement is involved in this conversation with us, and we get to sit at the table with them. And that's fairly amazing. So I don't believe that changing a law will fix this. I believe that it's part of a long process, but we're in the process.
How many people have been prosecuted? I'm just very interested.
You know what? I can probably get that number to you, but we have one of the things that we have as a format for every time we talk is I will not state a statistic I cannot cite. So I am more than happy to get that data to you and to tell you what it was beforehand. And remember, this law was just instituted in July of 2011. So we have just hit the 2-year mark, and I can certainly check and see. But I do know the other thing that happened when this law was passed is that the media started covering more of these stories. Whereas these stories never made news before, now we're hearing more about them. And we're hearing people of influence who are also being, you know, we actually had a person who was a businessman living in a very affluent area who was charged with buying, which was a huge deal. Now, we don't have many of those yet, but I will certainly get that to you. Mm-hmm.
Cheryl, I'm perplexed because from what you say, there are no federal laws that apply to buying and selling children. You insinuate that the only thing that you have to fall back on is a recent law passed by Georgia. It's inconceivable to me that there are not any federal laws that make this a crime.
There are federal laws, and I am not a lawyer, and this is, you know, and so I have somebody who trains me on legislative issues. There are federal trafficking laws, and they exist. There is some way, and I have learned this through the few years that we've been doing this, that the states also have to implement certain laws to coordinate or to make or to, you know, that some of these federal laws, I guess, have to have local buy-in or some sort of standing. There's a group here in the United States, and that just lets you know how little I know about it because I talked all around that question. But there's an organization, Shared Hope, that is actually looking at the laws in all 50 states and grading them as far as how they are in support of the ending of trafficking. Georgia has got a B. But there were only 7 Bs in the nation, and B is the highest ranking that they have given out so far. So I know that we have put additional laws in place to support what may be federally mandated.
President Carter? We have worked with the FBI at a level in the Super Bowl and also here at the Final Four. And the federal government gets involved when there's crossing state lines with minors in sex trafficking. So there is laws in the books. I couldn't tell you what they are or what the penalty is, but we have worked with them at the crossing the state lines coming to sport events.
I'll ask my grandson.
Yes. Any closing comments, Mr. President? Okay. Mona, any closing comments from you? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to turn it over to Karen at this point. Thank you very much.
Well, this is just such a great panel. It's very specific and gives everyone a lot to think about. I wanted to just, before we break, just take a moment to acknowledge my colleague, Sam Jones, who has put a lot of work. Stand up, Sam. Stand up. Sam took a lot of care in between all of his work managing our Congo programs and our Palestine project and everything else he's doing to really get to know these new friends that we have and to work with the Georgia Department of Education on the conference last month, and is taking the lead on this to see what we can do together. And so I wanted Sam to be recognized for his good work. So now we will go to break, and we have 27 minutes, and we will start precisely at 4:15, and enjoy your break.